This is Fort Myers, Florida, the fastest growing city and the fastest growing state in all of North America. But once a quaint beachside community, Fort Myers has become just the latest Florida city, overrun with opportunity that has brought more development, traffic congestion, hotels, and luxury condominiums. Of course, Fort Myers needed the investment as Hurricane Ian devastated much of southwestern Florida just last year. But this new Fort Myers is really just a microcosm of changes happening all across the state of Florida.
1,500 people are moving to Central Florida each week.
Things that draw people to the Sunshine State are the very things challenged by our rapid growth.
There's not enough infrastructure to support that.
There are growing pains.
It isn't just beachy cities impacted by tropical storms either, though Florida certainly experiences more than its fair share of tropical storms. And getting funding and building permits is much easier in cities reeling with disaster. But the redevelopment happening in Florida is happening all over the state. However, much of the development happening in Florida is the same kind of overbuilt and overpriced hotels, offices, and condos that never really seem to be in short supply there. See, Florida has become this recent beacon for American growth and prosperity, first breaking $1 trillion in revenue, then $1.4 trillion seemingly overnight, overtaking New York as the nation's third most populous state in just 2014. But Florida isn't the nation's third biggest economy, that would still be New York, and growth in Florida feels different than what we're seeing with other US states. Texas growth has been fueled by the relocation of several important technology companies. Growth in Arizona has come from attracting some of the world's biggest microchip manufacturers. And Utah and Arizona have been focused on becoming the second or third homes of some of America's most important technology companies like Adobe, Facebook, Microsoft, and Workforce. So while some large banks are opening offices in the Palm Beach area, and several medium-sized tech companies have opened in or relocated to various Florida cities, it lacks the kind of modernized economic movement we're seeing from other growth states. Instead, Florida's growth looks a lot more like strip malls, chain restaurants, and tourism centers. Now, I don't want to seem drastic here, because the story of Florida isn't the story of some poverty-stricken state where residents are fed up and fleeing for greener pastures. No, Florida is the greener pastures that millions of Americans are fleeing to. It's just that Florida is still facing a concerning future nonetheless. And it isn't just the growing people problem or the problematic geography there either. While other states are struggling through severely diminished economics and population decline, Florida's economy seems to be buckling under the weight of its own success. But that success has always been far more precarious than it appears. That's to say, the clouds are gathering all over the Sunshine State. But the question is Florida going broke? CNBC recently described Florida's economy as being white hot and well balanced while touting the state's strong economic growth and seemingly bright future. And honestly, that's true, at least at first glance. Florida is really booming, with an unemployment rate of just 2.7%. Newfound economic diversification into modern technology industries like semiconductors, aerospace, and fintech, major growth in advanced manufacturing, and with the state gaining residents at a rate 10 times higher than your typical state, the data is clear. Americans are choosing Florida over places like New York and California for its unique culture, low taxes, and growing opportunity. But this isn't Florida's first experience with having a boom period, and the state isn't nearly as recession-proof as we often hear. No, before South Florida became an epicenter for the Great Recession in 2007, before 1970s oil shortages brought the entire state to a screeching halt, long before Walt Disney brought his Kingdom of Magic to empty swamplands in Central Florida, even before the rise and collapse of Florida's land rush in the 1920s, the state had proven itself as a magnet for boom and bust cycles, and Florida is at least as reactive to national headwinds as anywhere else. When I heard that Florida was the fastest growing state in the United States for the first time since 1957, I decided to do some research into what happened back in the 1950s that brought so many new residents there in the first place. The TLDR is that growth period came from the rising accessibility of air conditioning and the baby boom peaking. Honestly, that peak was short-lived, but the state continued growing, just at a slower rate, and for very different reasons. as stagnated growth turned Florida developers to America's aging population. Starting with the 1960s, Florida developers started marketing the state as this retirement dreamland with affordable living and beautiful weather. That's actually something that has continued to define Florida's success in economics and population to this day. In fact, if you were to only consider natural demographic changes, Florida's population would be on the decline. And after years of marketing the state as the retirement capital of America, with Florida depending heavily on aging Americans to fuel the growth of its housing market and prop up planned community developments, Florida has turned itself into one of the oldest and still fastest aging states in all of the US. That's to say, Florida's population base, which is already facing some of the nation's worst inflationary pressures, is filled with aging Americans on a set budget that increasingly come from outside the state. While the economy there is built mostly on manual labor and service sector employment, creating a major labor shortage and cost of living crisis. As wealthy part-time residents and corporate investment firms continue to drive up the cost of living, while the kind of jobs that can support a family in modern Florida are limited. But that's only part of the story, because regular Floridians being left behind and the continued deterioration of the state's already tiny middle class is really more a symptom of Florida's deeper financial woes. Now, I'm not saying that I can pinpoint the exact underlying issue that has caused Florida, one of America's most business-friendly states, to have such awful inequity and high poverty, but I will say that other business-friendly states appear to have a much more cohesive approach to growth, and the problem with Florida's economy seems to come mostly from the state's overall lack of economic diversification and a business climate that favors the already favored. Let me explain. While Florida is growing at the top and bottom line, it has experienced a lot of difficulty in any attempt to better diversify its economy into more modern growth sectors. So the state is getting older while seeing much of its growth come from the same industries that it's always relied far too heavily on. Industries with inherently limited future prospects and less than stellar pay. That's to say, agriculture, tourism, and real estate have maintained their stronghold over the state of Florida, regardless of how many tech companies it courts or how many startup incubators and accelerators are opened across the state. Just consider that a single company, Disney, which is headquartered in a completely different state, Burbank, California, accounts for 2.5% of Florida's total economic output. How significantly problematic water contamination and shortages can shutter Florida's third largest industry, as agriculture there is deeply dependent on vast water usage. And while years of building codes that can no longer keep up with the state's high potential for environmental damage should continue to fuel the state's real estate and construction industries, many experts believe that Florida is already in another housing bubble. And then there's the Miami of it all. You may already know that Jacksonville is technically the biggest Florida city, with 971,000 residents, but when you compare it to Metro Miami-Dade, it isn't even close. As metropolitan Miami is the second largest urbanized area in the United States, and it's instrumental to Florida's need to push into finance, commerce, and international trade, some of the most important sectors to the economic diversification that Florida is in such dire need of. But Miami is a city on the decline for the first time in more than 50 years, as Miami's middle and working classes have been priced out of the city, pushing the residents Miami needs most further into the suburbs or outside of the metropolitan completely. None of this is to say that Florida's economy is doomed. No, states like New York and California face even greater uncertainty, and it's places like Mississippi and West Virginia that are in real crisis. But when you hear about the unstoppable growth happening in Florida, as if growing just for the sake of growing is always a good thing, I think it's worth at least weighing the wishfulness of it all, with the downside of endless growth,